Hello and welcome. My name's Nancy H. I'm one of the Bible teachers at First Presbyterian Church of Bonita Springs, and my daughter Abigail is with me today. We're going to share with you some of the story of Esther, Queen Esther, a rags to riches story from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures. If you're familiar with the Book of Esther, you may remember it as a wonderful Cinderella story of a girl who wins the beauty contest, marries the king, King Xerxes, the king of one of the great empires in history. She gets revenge on her enemy and saves her people, the Jews. But it's so much more than that. It's the display of the sovereign hand of God working through several defining moments of Esther's life so that everyone and everything reaches its appropriate outcome, God's appropriate outcome. It's God's great unseen power waiting for just the right moment to be revealed, and then we are overwhelmingly and undeniably aware of his power, his plan, his provision, his purpose, his promise. Esther was gifted with strong faith, with brilliant strategies and prophetic revelations, and she was beautiful. These equipped her at just the right time to save her people from annihilation.
The story takes place sometime between the years of 518 to 465 BC, about 500 years before Jesus was born. It was during the reign of King Xerxes. He was a king who reigned over 127 provinces in the country of Persia. That was most of the known land at that time. Who knew that beneath his magnificent throne, a battle of 1,000 years was brewing just beneath the surface? Esther was born into this battle. She was born for such a time as this. This is God's sovereignty on display. God making sure that everyone and everything reaches its appropriate outcome. It includes reversals of fortune, serendipities, coincidences, perfect timings, vengeance, and justice.
The backstory involves two races, two nations, the Israelites, whom God has promised to bless and preserve, and the Amalekites, foreigners and pagans, whom he had promised to put out of his remembrance forever. The Lord had sworn, I will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. It was God's intent that this conflict, a conflict which began nearly 1,000 years before, should take place under the rule of King Xerxes and Queen Esther, and the ungodly leadership of Haman, who was the resident and unsuspecting Amalekite. We love the foretaste of victory that's ahead for Esther, but let's look at her backstory for a minute.
Esther was born in God's perfect time, in his perfect place, in his perfect season, to fulfill his perfect plan for his chosen people. It doesn't appear to be a great beginning for Esther. She was an orphan. She was living in a foreign land with foreign customs and foreign people. She was actually born into captivity twice. First, her people had been taken into captivity when the Babylonians captured the city of Jerusalem, and then she was taken into the king's harem. We sometimes tend to glamorize this as a beauty contest, and she wins a beauty contest, and she gets a year of beauty treatments. But it's not that. She's been taken into an ungodly harem of an ungodly pagan king. This is an early form of sex trafficking. It's not a great beginning. So, how is it that God's going to make everyone and everything reach its appropriate outcome for good?
What happens in chapter 1 sets the stage for this exciting, and I might say, even comical at times, magnificent display of the sovereignty of God. When Queen Vashti refuses the request of King Xerxes to come before his drunken partygoers, she gets displaced and a new queen is chosen. Chapter 2, enter Queen Esther. She's treated royally. She finds great favor with the king, and this favor is going to serve her well in the future.
Then let's move to chapter 3. In chapter 3, we have our next serendipity. Mordecai, Esther's uncle and guardian, overhears two men plotting against the king to take his life. Mordecai reports this to Esther. Esther, in turn, reports it to the king, and the king's life is spared. The two men are hanged on a gallows. All of this is recorded in the journal of the king. Also in chapter 3, we read the first hints of the coming doomsday plot. King Xerxes promoted Haman, who is of the lineage of the Amalekites, making him the most powerful official of the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before him and show him respect whenever he passed by. It was the commandment of the king, but Mordecai did not.
But Mordecai did not. He did not. He was a Jew, and he was not going to bow down to a pagan ruler. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai the Jew alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all of the Jews throughout the entire empire of Persia. Haman asked the king to issue a decree that all of the Jews be destroyed. It's unthinkable, except it has happened before and is happening now. The king gives his signet ring to Haman, just seemingly rather casually, and the decree is sent out by couriers throughout the whole nation, 127 provinces. 127 provinces get this decree. With this decree, the king has sealed the fate of Esther and her people.
So let's move to chapter 4. Mordecai learns of this plot. He's able to get a message to Esther, and he entreats her to go to the king and beg for mercy, beg for her life and for her people. Esther tells Mordecai that she has not been summoned to the king for 30 days. The scripture says, all of the king's officials and all the people of the province, this is Esther telling Mordecai, they know that anyone who appears before the king without being summoned is doomed to die, unless the king holds out his gold scepter. Then Mordecai responds. This is a paraphrase. He says, young lady, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you'll escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at this time, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and all of your family will die. And then his famous line that we often quote to one another. He says to Esther, who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? We say that to one another in crucial times. Who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
We have said that 100 times probably. Esther responds with her whole heart. I think she doesn't miss a beat. I think she responds immediately, and she says, go and gather all the Jews, all of the Jews of Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. My handmaidens and I will do the same thing. Then, though it is against the law, I will go in and see the king. And if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had said immediately. So how is it that God is going to make sure that everyone and everything reaches its appropriate outcome? We will see the sovereign hand of God working through several defining moments of Esther's life. It's God's great unseen power waiting for just the right moment to be revealed. And then we are overwhelmingly and undeniably aware of his power, his plan, his provision, his purpose. In chapter 5, Esther is received by the king as he reaches out his golden scepter. She makes her request, a dinner invitation for him and Haman. At the same time, in a comical turn of events, because Mordecai was able to sidetrack the plot to kill the king, King Xerxes wants to honor Mordecai. And Haman, the villain, remember, serendipitously is at the wrong place at the wrong time and gets recruited to lead Mordecai on horseback with the king's robe through the city streets proclaiming, This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Haman's rage and humiliation emboldens him to build a gallows on which to hang Mordecai.
Chapter 7. Guess who's coming to dinner? So the king and Haman appear at Esther's house, and Esther reveals the plot against the Jews, and she exposes Haman the Amalekite as the adversary and the great enemy. The king cries, "Hang him on his own gallows!" Thus the Amalekites are put out of God's remembrance forever, just as God had promised. And the king takes back his signet ring. He gives Haman's property to Queen Esther, and he sends out a new decree to save the Jews. And Mordecai becomes second in rank to the king. The scripture in chapter 10 says, Mordecai is held in high esteem by many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of the people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews.
This great story displays the sovereign hand of God working through several defining moments of Esther's life so that everyone and everything reaches its appropriate outcome, God's appropriate outcome. And even though it's an ancient story, it is a true story. It's about a woman who saved her nation. But it's also a story about us, our story of making tough choices sometimes. We don't know right now, in this day and age, whether we might be called to actually say, and if I perish, I perish. We make a bold statement for the truth. We stand up for Jesus and we say, and if I perish, I perish. It's an ancient story, but a very relevant story. It's about one nation against another nation, even now, today. It's a very relevant story. And we wait to see God's great unseen power revealed. We believe that Esther was born for such a time as this, at just the right time, in just the right place, to just the right people in order to serve God's ultimate purpose and plan. And if we believe that about Esther, we can believe it for ourselves. We can trust that we're born at just the right time, just the right place, to just the right people, so that we reach our appropriate outcome, God's ultimate purpose and plan for us. I'm left with two questions at the end of the story. Number one, why didn't Mordecai pack up everything and go back to Jerusalem when he heard that Esther would be required to go into this evil harem? Of course, we would have a different story. And even though I might think Mordecai's decision was a very foolish one, I'm left with awe and wonder of how God redeems our foolish decisions over and over again. What Satan means for evil, God redeems for good. It reminded me of Joseph's story, kind of the same story. What Satan meant for evil was redeemed for good in Joseph's life, and he saved his people. So it's a similar story. My second question is, who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The kingdom of your family, the kingdom of your church, the kingdom of your friends, kingdom of your circles of friends. Who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Thanks very much for joining us on this journey through the Book of Esther, a favorite book for many of us, and I appreciate your being here and hope you will ask yourself the same question. Who knows but that I've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Thank you.